In 1968, Congress established the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars as the nation's memorial to its 28th president. Last week, we explored the center's mission and role in the world of public policy. Today, we take a look at the work of one of our center's current scholars. This week on Dialogue, Living Memorial Part 2, Rethinking U.S. National Security Strategy. Hello again and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. This week, we'll explore the work of one of the center's current public policy scholars who's focusing on U.S. strategy as it relates to national security. A little later in the program, we'll hear from high school students who join us in the studio. They've traveled to Washington from Alaska, California, Georgia, Texas, and Utah to participate in the Close-Up Academy program. Welcome to all of you. We'll look forward to hearing your questions and comments a bit later. Our guests for this discussion are Barry Posen. Barry is a professor of political science and director of security studies at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's also a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. And also joining us again is Robert Litwak. Rob is vice president for programs and director of international security studies at the center. Welcome back, Rob, and welcome to the program, Barry, for the first time. Rob, if we could, I remember the first time you and I met was around a project we did here on the air with my predecessor, our dearly departed colleague George C.A., and our focus was the post-Cold War era. We were seeking to describe what is the political strategy, the military strategy, all the various diplomatic strategies related to this new world order. In some ways, it feels like we haven't progressed very far in that regard. We're still trying to sort that out. So if you could talk a bit about the big picture in national security and then maybe relate it to Barry's specific work here.
Well, let me provide some context. Welcome to all of you at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Woodrow Wilson, our 28th President of the United States, is identified with one particular approach to international relations: idealism or liberalism. And to those who believe in idealism or liberalism, the answer to the question, how do you achieve international peace, is to proliferate democracies. If we live in a world of democracies which operate through international institutions, that is a pathway to international peace. Now, the alternative perspective on this question of how to achieve peace is offered by realists. And they focus not on the internal organization of societies, whether it's a democracy or not, but rather on the distribution of power between states, the balance of power. And probably the most prominent proponent of that approach in the 20th century was Henry Kissinger. In a sense, U.S. foreign policy is a dialogue between Woodrow Wilson and Henry Kissinger. During the Cold War, we faced the Soviet Union, and we used both approaches. We had NATO that balanced Soviet power, but we also were Wilsonian in that we tried to create a community of democracies with institutions. It was an enormously successful venture, creating security and wealth in a large part of the world. When the Cold War ended, U.S. strategy shifted to how do we incorporate these previously excluded parts of the world into this international order. The approach of the Clinton administration was engagement and enlargement. Let's integrate these parts of the world into the system. Now, this was sort of one perspective on it, but many questions remain. What about great power adversaries like China and Russia? Can they be successfully brought into the system? What about new security threats like Al-Qaeda, which are non-state actors that are operating in states around the world? How do we address those threats? How do we pay for it? Is it sustainable for the United States? These are the questions that have emerged from the Cold War era in which we live.
Barry, talk to us about this term, grand strategy. What is its origins? What does it mean?
Well, grand strategy is a term that's been around for many, many years, and it goes into and out of use. But basically, it's an elite's or a country's ideas about how to cause security for itself. And this raises the question to start with, what is security? And usually when we talk about security in international politics, the definition that realists like myself use focus on this sovereignty, your ability to make your own decisions for yourself, territorial integrity, the ability to hold on to your own country, the safety of your population, and then your overall relative power position, which is the means to the end of security in a world that tends to be quite competitive. And what grand strategy is in its basic elements is an enumeration of what are the potential threats to security as we've defined it, what is the priority of those threats, what are the potential remedies to those threats, and those remedies could be alliances or nuclear weapons or non-nuclear weapons or something else, and a set of priorities among those, and then a little story that connects them all together, that explains what the connections are and why the connections are believed to hold true. And sometimes you find grand strategies written down in a very coherent way, locked away in the safe sometimes.
Where would you find those? Who writes them down and where?
Well, we used to be pretty explicit about this during the Cold War. We used to do this in the National Security Council, that works directly for the president. And many of the documents were secret, although they would, they often leaked. Since the passage of the Goldwater-Nichols Act, the year escapes me, it's law that we actually have a public version of the grand strategy. So, for example, if you go back to the Clinton administration, I think they published some version of their grand strategy every year, and you could read it. And it was written in a way that was relatively accessible to people. It's also available in PDF, so you can do word searches if you want to look for particular themes and compare them. The Bush administration published only 2, in part because they were at war, and there were a lot of documents that weren't published while they were busy in their minds waging the war. The emphasis in these publicly stated grand strategies has been somewhat different between the 2 administrations, and even within administrations. You can look at the first document in the Clinton administration, the last document of the Clinton administration, you can actually find some movement. At the same time, it's my view that there's quite a lot of consensus on grand strategy across the parties in the United States.
Is that a tradition that we're losing, this lack of partisanship when it relates to grand strategy?
Well, there's a considerable consensus. Certainly during the Cold War, there was a consensus on strategy, and there were differences over what would be the means by which the United States would seek to contain the Soviet Union. But there was a core consensus there. I think if one looks at current U.S. Foreign policy and grand strategy, if you will, one's struck by a considerable degree of consensus within that. But at the same time, these national security strategy documents that Barry alluded to reflect this ongoing tension in U.S. policy. If you look at it, and because of the way bureaucracies write these documents, you have paragraphs, you can see where different parts of it are coming from. And you see some elements of it that reflect the realist school, that we have to be cognizant of a rising China and Russia. Could they become adversaries of the United States again? You see other parts that could have been written by Woodrow Wilson, focusing on the role of institutions and democratization. There's this tension that's worked through. Yeah, this tension that's sort of at play. And I think it's a tension that, in the end, the United States is never going to resolve. It's going to be there, and the issue for administrations is how do you manage that tension? Mm-hmm.
Barry, one of the things you've written uses this phrase. You describe current strategy as being active in managing the world's international and internal security problems with the U.S. military forward deployed. Explain what forward deployed means.
Well, during the Cold War, the United States got used to the idea that it had to keep a lot of military power deployed abroad, mostly around the periphery of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union stretched across Eurasia from Europe to Asia, and therefore some Russian troops could probably threaten almost anyone. And those who felt threatened liked having some American troops nearby on guard, either to help dissuade the Soviets from attacking or to balance out the missing elements of their own capabilities. And these were lots of troops, and we had hundreds of thousands of troops forward deployed at sea, on land, air units, quite a lot. When the Cold War ended, people scratched their heads and said, well, the Soviets are gone, Russia's a much weaker state, people are more secure, but we sort of like being out there, right, because it gives us some influence over events. So the numbers shrunk, but they didn't shrink to zero. We still had several 100,000 troops deployed abroad, more or less ready for anything. And with the events of September 11, 2001, and the various ways that the struggle with terrorism was interpreted, we ended up sending more forces abroad again to participate in these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we have forces abroad at war and forces abroad on guard, right? right? So, and this is on a global scale, and those forces are ready to fight. They're not sort of just sitting around. They're training. They've got their not just their arms and weapons with them, but ammunition and on supplies, everything that's needed to go to war, command and control, communications, intelligence, right? So it's a very energetic effort, and it's fed by a quite large defense budget. The American defense budget consumes about 4% of the GDP of this country, and just when you do the arithmetic, 4% of American GDP is a little bit over 1% of gross world product. So more than 1% of all the wealth produced in the world every year passes through the hands of the American Pentagon for the purposes of securing this country and its interests.
Along those lines, whenever that budget comes up for debate, there are talks about troops deployed in a model that reflects a Cold War era and not present threats. There are talks about weapon systems that really don't relate to what are the likely threats now. If both of you could put your heads together and based on your assessment of the current threats and your knowledge of current military strategy, what needs to change? You know, what would make it more relevant?
Let me just say that I think that there's a considerable degree of consensus on many of these issues. And what's exciting about the work that Professor Posen's doing is that he's challenging some of these conventional wisdoms. I mean, one of the roles of the Wilson Center, as a former director of ours put it, we're here to provide tentative answers to big questions rather than definitive answers to tiny questions. And I think what's exciting about Professor Posen's project is that he is using his base at the Woodrow Wilson Center to look at some of these big issues, and his critique is an important one that needs to be part of the public policy debate right now, and I think that's why the Center is pleased to have him.
And some of what you've written is that the current strategy may not be sustainable.
Well, I believe the current strategy isn't sustainable, but just to put in context a little bit your question, the conventional way the debate is going on today about American military spending is essentially bifurcated. Right? There's a set of capabilities that we buy that are really the most advanced capabilities on the planet, the most advanced conventional capabilities on the planet. And those capabilities are aimed at fighting someone who's almost as good as we are. Almost as rich as we are, almost as technologically sophisticated as we are, air, land, space,
whatever. A war
whatever.
between superpowers.
A war between, the problem is there aren't any others. So we compete with ourselves. In other words, every year on that side of the defense budget, which is most of the defense budget, we're trying to make ourselves better than us. Right? And what we really need to do is focus on these smaller wars, on wars about the nature of the regimes in other countries, wars against insurgents, et cetera, et cetera. So it's peacekeeping or peace enforcement or counterinsurgency. And there is a tension in the defense budget between people who say, look, if I have an extra dollar to spend, I want to spend it on big war capabilities to deter China down the road, or small war capabilities to deal with the wolves who are at the door, or conversely, if I had to cut the defense budget by $1, which is what I think is coming, right, I'd rather cut one of these or the other. Now, that's the internal debate in the United States today within the consensus that exists. My position is that our whole project is excessive, that some parts of this project are actually unnecessary. In other words, regardless of what the American military has been doing in Iraq or Afghanistan, these kinds of wars are not so essential to American national security. They're incredibly costly. They create new political problems of their own that generate new reasons for more wars of this kind. And the United States really should be thinking about backing away from these things. And as far as the possibility of superpower competition, my argument is the United States always has to be ready for this, but that it's not imminent. So we have to be judicious in the capabilities that we produce. So overall, our defense budget, defense effort should diminish in my theory, and a big chunk of the shrinkage should really come from the kinds of capabilities that have been bought for these stability type operations, counterinsurgency, and the like.
Let me ask you, before we turn to your questions, another term that might be useful to you to understand is multipolarity. I see that turning up in the things you've written. Explain to us what multipolarity is.
Well, multipolarity, refers to a world in which there are many powers. One thinks of a classical multipolar system in the 19th century, great power politics. With the end of the Cold War,
not where we are now, but where we may be headed.
With the end of the Cold War, there was talk about the United States as emerging as the sole superpower, a hyperpower, what one U.S. diplomat called a super-duper power, and that status fed into this sort of this expansive conception of what U.S. foreign policy should be in the world. That conception that Professor Posen's critiquing, and in his work, one of the questions is, is this distribution of power shifting? Answer, yes. You have rising China, rising Russia, et cetera. So in certain respects, the world will remain unipolar, so to speak. I mean, in terms of military power, I think it's still the case that the United States is equal to the sum of practically the rest of the world combined. So in military terms, the world will remain kind of unipolar, if you will. But in terms of economic power, et cetera, we will see other powers that have already risen, European Union, China, et cetera, which will shift this distribution. The United States will remain a great power, an important power, but it will not dominate the system in the way that it had in the past, or which some would hope that it would continue to do.
And part of what your research is indicating is that these aren't disconnected. If you don't have the economic power, you can't exercise all of that military might.
Well, it's an old story. The economic base of your country is the raw material from which your military capability is distilled, right? So United States profited from the fact that it had the largest share of world GDP when the Cold War ended, also when the Second World War ended, and had the ability to distill more military capacity than others did from that base. We also had the inclination, which others did not have, right? In part because they thought it was so difficult to challenge us. But as the base capabilities begin to become more equal, then the difficulties of challenging the Americans on the military side also begin to diminish, and you'll begin to see a bit more competition. People are focusing on China now, and China, it's a growing power, a growing economy, very dynamic. Their military capability is improving, and some people say it's improving very quickly. I'm a little bit more skeptical about that, but it is improving, and that's to be expected as the overall economic capacity of a country improves, as its ability to pursue its interests in the system improves, and as the interests as they conceive them begin to increase. All of that is going to make them a stronger competitor, but not just with us. Others who live near China are also going to be inclined to compete with China. So that's where you get into a situation that's more multipolar than unipolar, when there are several states that can balance the power of one, or coalitions of states balancing the power of each other. But on the whole, I think the direction of things in terms of America's basic capabilities relative to others is there's going to be some diminution of the gap that's in our favor. The diminution is meaningful. It's not cliff-like. We're not falling off a cliff here, and that's going to begin to affect what we can do in the world and how others see us and our need for allies, et cetera, et cetera. A change seems to be in the wind.
Okay. Let's find out what's on your mind. Yes, sir, you're first. Hi.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm from Fairbanks, Alaska. And first of all, thank you guys for being here. This is great. My question is regarding the U.S. foreign policy in China. As you all know, China has basically invaded Tibet. Been a while now. They've sent an influx of Chinese to disrupt the Tibetan vote. And so I understand this is a pretty complicated topic, but I was just wondering if there's any policies right now regarding that, or if there are any foreseeable policies in the future.
Well, I think I think all you need to know is captured in the president's recent visit to China. And the president acknowledged that Tibet is a part of China. That issue was closed, right, as far as the United States is concerned. And there's almost nobody else that could have the influence over China to get them to reopen that issue. So I think that's point one. Point two is Americans, and more generally people in the West, we tend to be concerned about human rights the world over, and we do the best we can when we get interested to try and encourage governments to behave better towards minorities in the territory they claim to control. So I think there'll be slow pressure on the Chinese to do a little bit better towards that minority and towards others, but I don't think anybody should hope for the reemergence of an independent Tibet.
Hi. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Carol Abraham from Utah. Dr. Posen, you seem pretty enthusiastic about having troops in all of the nations, but do you believe that the same action could pose a threat on the United States, how these countries view our country?
Well, actually, I'm unenthusiastic about having troops in other nations. In other words, my position is that the United States has too many troops forward deployed, doing too many different things, and it has there are several negative consequences that arise from these forward deployments. Now, some of this is actual warfare, and while I'm not a pacifist, and I believe you should have a strong military, and from time to time you should use it, war is a pretty blunt instrument. And once should take great care with launching them, and one should understand that they have unintended consequences. And I think the American propensity since the Cold War ended to use force often has probably turned inside itself in terms of generating hostility to the United States. But there's some other problems that arise from having military power forward deployed, and that is that other states who could do more to defend themselves and who could contribute more to keeping order in the world do less because they know the Americans are there and the Americans will do more. So we have some very wealthy allies, Japan, the various states of Europe, and whereas we spend 4 or 5% of GDP on defense, depending on how you count, Japan spends 1% of GDP on defense. Most of the Europeans are spending around 2%. They're rich countries, they're capable countries, they have the same security interests in their regions, not identical but similar to our own. They could do more. They don't have to do more because they know the Americans will. So I think this is another negative consequence of these forward deployments.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Mauricio from Texas. I was wondering, you mentioned that after the Cold War, during the Cold War, Americans were happy to be, protecting the border around Russia or the USSR, and that after they were pulled back, the Americans were kind of enthusiastic about it. So do you think that the United States likes to be involved in? You're saying that the United States enjoys being known all over the world to be the protectors, or why are they sending out troops into
This is an excellent question, and it speaks to the points that Rob was making earlier. I think two things came together when the Cold War ended. These Wilsonian ideals that Rob is talking about that are deeply embedded in American thinking about the world. The idea that America will be more secure if more countries are more like us, at least from the point of view of how their politics are organized, which is to say liberal, democratic, market-oriented economies, right? So there's an impulse when the Cold War ended, in other words, when we weren't facing Soviet opposition, rather than to retract because we were safer, to say, aha, this is a moment where we could conceivably further spread American ideas about politics in the world. And then the second thing that's important here is that when the Cold War collapsed, the United States was left as sort of the last truly great power standing with this influence all over the world. Now, it's always been true in international political history that when one power is much stronger than its neighbors, it tends to try and exert its influence over the system. It's very tempting because you have the capacity. So this marriage of liberal ideals with a terrific power advantage, I think helped produce quite a lot of energy that many people thought was going to bring a much better world, but which in my judgment is not bringing that much better a world, but certainly is bringing higher cost to the United States.
Hi, go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Taylor from Virginia. I just have a quick question. As you previously stated, a lot of nations are sort of climbing their way up to be superpowers, not so much on the same level as the United States, but a lot of nations are making, stands for themselves and are notable financially and economically, and militarily. But are there any nations in particular that you think we should be adjusting our foreign policy towards as they steadily start to become more and more prevalent on the world stage?
Are you sort of looking for the list of priorities of other nations?
You could say that. Yeah.
Foreign policy.
Well, as we discussed earlier, the conception in the 1990s was that our former communist adversaries, Russia and China, could be successfully integrated into the international order. One of the great debates in international relations today is whether that's possible or not. Will China and Russia become, and a term that's used often is stakeholders, will they become stakeholders in the society? They'll see that their interests lie in deeper integration into the system. China holds considerable U.S. debt in treasury bills. Does that give them an interest in a more stable order? The realists have, I think, lost some prominence with the end of the Cold War.
We were never prominent.
They argue that as the power of these former adversaries rises again, that just the inherent nature of international relations is that our interests will rub up against each other, and the possibility for some rupture, in relations exists. My personal view is we could get to that point. We could mismanage relations to get to kind of an adversarial relationship with China in the middle of the century. But if properly managed, there's no axiomatic reason why our interests can't be made compatible. We saw that with Russia in summer of 08 when Russia intervened in Georgia. And I think at that time there was alarm went up that maybe, was this the beginning of a new Cold War? Was Russia becoming the Soviet Union again? I think what happened in Georgia was more akin to traditional great power politics. Russia is a great power. It will try to control events and actors on its periphery. I think it's very consistent with that interpretation of
our economic entanglement with China is at a much different level than it ever was with Russia.
The historians debate it. I mean, we had a lot of, there was a lot of economic entanglement between England and Germany, and this is a great debate in international relations. It's a persistent one, but I'm just trying to identify what are the poles of the debate and what's the tension there between these two approaches.
Hi, go ahead. Time for one more quick question.
Oh, okay. Well, hi, I'm Daniela from Texas, and my question is there a clear mission for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? If so, what is it, and has it changed during the past 6 years?
And can you describe it in 30 seconds?
I don't think there was a clear mission in Iraq. I mean, the mission that the Bush administration originally had in Iraq, they realized after they were there for a month that mission was never there. In other words, the mission was to get rid of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. It turned out Iraq didn't have any. So then they invented a new mission, which was to leave Iraq a functioning democracy and an ally of the United States and capable of defending itself. And I still don't think we've achieved all those things. What we seem to have achieved after much bloodletting is a stabilization of the bloodletting and a platform for the Iraqis to work out their own differences. In Afghanistan, again, originally we went to try and get the people who organized the attack on the United States, and those people mostly managed to get away. And then, of course, we went to get the regime that had hosted them, and most of those people got away. And now the game in Afghanistan is to ensure that the people who had hosted them don't come back to power. And this is a kind of a negative goal. And the question is, since those people, the Taliban, are deeply rooted in Afghan society, is it really possible to expel them entirely from Afghan politics? And I have my doubts.
And I'm so sorry we have to rush out on this big question, but we are out of time, gentlemen. Thank you for your questions and comments. Unfortunately, we are out of time. And in addition to thanking our guests and the Close-Up Academy students, we want to thank you for watching and know that we appreciate your comments and encourage you to share them with us. You can do so by sending email to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. And if you'd like more information about the Close-Up program and all of the students who've been here, you can visit them on the web at www.closeup.org. So until next week, for all of us at the Wilson Center and Dialogue, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching.
Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.